Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My apologies for this morning's class and the fact that we weren't actually able to do it. There were problems with the technology in the classroom, so I am recording the lecture right now, so you guys will be able to watch this on YouTube. So again, apologies for the fact that this morning we couldn't have class. So here's today's lecture. And just as a reminder, your midterm exam is due Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. All right, so we finished up with the Texas legislature last week, and today we're going to start talking about the governor. We're going to talk about terms, staff, and some of the qualifications, both formal and informal, for running for governor. Okay. So the elections for governor are held in an even-numbered, non-presidential election. This is done so that the national issues don't dominate or overshadow state issues. So Governor Abbott was reelected in 2018, and he's up for reelection in 2022. The idea is to keep the focus on the state by not holding it during a presidential election year. And elections do tend to focus on personalities rather than issues. There is some discussion of the issues. But we tend to see more discussions about things like patriotism, conservative values, economics, not as much about a candidate's stance on the issue, but rather how they are perceived. And like a lot of other elections, there is lower voter turnout because it is essentially during a midterm election. So we did see about 46% voter turnout in 2018, which was higher than it had been in a long time, but still significantly smaller compared to a presidential election. Primary-wise, Democratic participation was up 56%, Republican turnout 30%. Part of that was with Greg Abbott being the incumbent, not as much attention compared to picking your party's candidate for the Democrats. So it used to be a 2-year term for the governor, but obviously that's not long enough to get work done. It's not long enough to meet all of the needs of the state. In 1974, the state legislature and the state constitution extended the term to 4 years, which is usually how long a governor has nationally. And there are no term limits. Governor Abbott can keep running until the voters decide they're sick of him. There's no limit on how many terms a governor is allowed to serve. All right, so usually the governors would only serve 2 terms, which was basically 4 years. But of course, nowadays, the governor can stay in as long as they want. Governor Ann Richards only served 1 term. George W. Bush was elected to a 2nd term before he resigned to run for president. This is Governor Abbott's 2nd term. He may choose to run again in 2022, or he may get challenged in the primaries. So the length of the stay in office depends on how the voters are feeling. Do they like what the governor is doing? Are they happy with the results? Do they like what they're seeing? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Right now, Governor Abbott's polling isn't as high because of the response to COVID. So he may or may not face a challenger in the Republican primary in 2022. It's going to depend on how the voters are feeling at that time and how well, in some ways, the economy is doing. So they can stay in office for 1 term, 5 terms. It's really up to the voters. And because Texas is such a large state and such an important factor in national politics, Texas governors, senators do enjoy a lot of national attention as future presidential or vice presidential candidates. Lyndon Johnson, right, becoming vice president under Kennedy. George W. Bush becoming president. Ted Cruz running for president. They are heavily considered because of the importance of Texas. Texas can help a candidate win. Part of the reason Kennedy won in 1960 was because of Lyndon Johnson. So Texas politicians do get a lot of national attention. If they give a speech, major media comes out to cover it. The decisions they make do have national and sometimes international implications. The way we interact with Mexico, that also gets a lot of attention. So the governor of Texas gets a lot more attention and support compared to other states. So they have a bigger platform, which can be both good and bad. All right, so if the governor breaks the law, if the governor does something wrong, we can remove him or her from office. Grounds for impeachment include official misconduct, incompetence, and failure to perform their duties. So for example, if the governor doesn't take part in the legislative sessions, or the governor accepts bribes for state contracts, then he or she can be impeached. Our state constitution doesn't explicitly define what's considered an impeachable offense, but usually it's something like corruption, bribery, inefficiency. Something pretty major usually has to happen for the governor to be impeached. And the process for impeachment is somewhat similar to the national level. The House acts as the grand jury, looking at the evidence and deciding whether or not to indict the governor. And they only need a simple majority. If the House decides to impeach the governor, it then goes to the Senate. And the Senate essentially acts as a trial court. They hear the evidence, they hear testimony, and then they decide whether or not to convict the governor. You do need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict the governor. So usually it has to be something where it's pretty obvious the governor broke the law. You don't necessarily see an impeachment process where one party wants to impeach the governor and the other one doesn't. It's going to take a pretty high level of support for that to happen. If the governor is convicted of a crime, he or she is removed from office immediately, and they can't hold any state office in the future. Hypothetically, if Governor Abbott was convicted of bribery, he would have to leave the governor's office right away, and he could never run for state office again. He could run for national office, but he couldn't run for any seat in Texas. If the governor is removed, resigns, for example, to run for a higher office, or dies, then the lieutenant governor takes over. If for some reason the lieutenant governor can't take over, for example, if they are also convicted because they were also guilty of a crime, or there was a vacancy because the lieutenant governor resigned, ran for another office, or died. What then happens is the president pro tempore of the Senate will act as the governor, and then there will be a election held in the Senate to have someone fulfill the duties of the lieutenant governor until the next election. So usually we only see the governor leaving. So when Governor Bush left to run for president, Rick Perry became the governor of Texas. And then the lieutenant governor's position has to be filled after that. There is a process of making sure that if the governor has to be removed from office, dies, or resigns, that the transition is fairly smooth, that we're not waiting to find out who's going to be the next governor. All right, so the governor is fairly well compensated. He or she gets a salary of $150,000 a year, which is pretty good for a governor, especially of a major state like Texas. Unfortunately, the lieutenant governor isn't quite as lucky. Because the lieutenant governor's role is more legislative than executive, they only get paid the $7,200 a year plus the per diem. So, unfortunately for the lieutenant governor, this is not a well-paid position. Now, if the lieutenant governor is filling in because the governor is having surgery or is traveling out of the state, they do get compensated for the time they spent as acting governor. So there is some compensation when they have to take over the executive duties, but otherwise they get paid next to nothing. In addition to their salary, the governor has the official mansion in Austin, a travel budget, the use of state-owned aircraft, a car, bodyguards who are provided by the Texas Department of Public Safety, and their own personal staff. It makes sense that the governor would need to be protected from possible harm, including physical violence, assassination, etc. So there are some perks for being governor. You get to live in a nice mansion, you get a decent salary, the state kicks in for some of your travel costs, and you are protected by the Department of Public Safety. All right, so the governor has a personal and a professional staff. Personal staff largely works in the governor's mansion. So the people who are in charge of scheduling tours, housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, etc. There's also the professional staff who will sometimes work with the state legislature to promote the governor's agenda, let the legislature know that there may be a veto. So some of the staff will work in the governor's mansion, some will work in the legislature or in the governor's office. They also make recommendations for appointments, making sure the governor is not double booked, help prepare the budget, coordinate the different departments, and schedule various appointments or activities. Things like speaking at an event, going to a UT football game, things like that are going to be coordinated by their personal and professional staff. They want to make sure the governor's schedule is set and that they're not trying to do too much or getting double booked. It's a lot of work. Governor Abbott has 250 staff members. You do need a fairly large staff in a state this big to do everything that the governor needs to do. And his office performs 7 important functions. The first is to help the governor with appointments, budget making, legal advice, human resources, scheduling, and homeland security. So a lot of the day-to-day functions. The second is to promote the interests of the Texas workforce, including opportunities for women and the disabled, talking about opportunities for people who have historically faced discrimination. The third is to help the governor with the media and communicating with citizens. So the governor is going to have staff who are in charge of his email, his Twitter, his Facebook page, his Instagram accounts, getting the message out and making sure that someone double checks to make sure it's not contentious or controversial, or too controversial. The staff also helps to work on reducing crime and providing statistics. States are required to provide information to the FBI and the federal government on crime statistics within the state, things like drug trafficking, murder, rape, burglaries, all of those have to be reported. So you can look at some of these statistics and see if our crime rate's gone down or if it's gone up. They also help the governor with things like economic growth and tourism, trying to get companies like Tesla to build a plant in Texas, which should be happening within the next couple of years, trying to bring in companies in Texas, tout our low business taxes, friendly business environment, and so on. Also helping with things like promoting physical fitness, which is kind of fluffy, but also the idea is try to keep Texas healthy. And the last thing they do is try to give advice about the state healthcare system. Is the system working? Do we have more people who need to be on Medicaid or Medicare? What about Social Security, the uninsured rates? So they do a lot of very important work for the governor. And they're all going to be divided into different branches, different functions. So if you want to learn how state government works, if there's a job opening on the governor's staff, that's a great way to get your feet wet, to learn more about state government. Sometimes they do offer internships for college students. All right, so the formal qualifications to be governor is that you have to be at least 30 years old, you have to be a U.S. citizen, and you have to have lived in Texas for 5 years immediately before the election. The governor has to be sworn in on the first Tuesday after the legislature meets. If there's an argument over who won the election, it goes to the legislature. So these formal qualifications aren't that much, right? They're pretty basic. You have to be 30, a citizen, and lived in Texas for 5 years. And that's not too complicated. It's really when we get down to the informal qualifications that we start to see the difference. Our governors have been traditionally white, male, Protestant, and wealthy. They are usually conservative, There are exceptions, but usually conservative. And if you held some other office, usually Attorney General or Lieutenant Governor, because these are high-profile state offices that can help them get some name recognition when they choose to run for governor. Now, Ann Richards was an exception to the rule. She was a woman, a Democrat, and she wasn't married. She was actually divorced. So she was a bit more liberal. She wanted environmental protection. She pushed for gun control. She was very much an exception to the rule. And part of that is why she only served one term, was because she was very different compared to her predecessors and the people who came after her. But Governor Perry and Governor Abbott had been more traditional candidates, white, wealthy, conservative, holding former offices. Governor Perry had been Governor Bush's lieutenant governor, and Abbott at one point was the state attorney general. So it's fairly common to see conservative, wealthy white men running for governor and getting elected compared to others. All right, so the political views do have somewhat of an impact. Part of the reason Ann Richards won was because, to put it bluntly, the Republican candidate was a bit of an idiot. I can't believe he actually did this. He said that rape is like bad weather. If it's inevitable, a woman should just relax and enjoy it. Yeah. Stupid. He also bragged about not paying income tax. So he said and did things that were really not helpful to winning. So part of the reason she won was because the Republican candidate was just terrible. I mean, people had a hard time justifying voting for that nutbag. Okay. Governor George W. Bush was a mainstream Republican. He did emphasize conservatism, wanted to cut the state welfare spending, and really started to push for a more business-friendly environment. Remember in the first week that I said that Texas gets very high ratings in terms of being business-friendly, but not necessarily worker-friendly. Well, it's because of George W. Bush that the state started to become a lot more business-friendly, lower taxes, and incentives to move into Texas. Governor Perry emphasized tax cuts, business interests. He was a traditional conservative. And the reality is, for governors, they do tend to be more conservative because they need the business owners, the bankers, and the lawyers to help fund their elections. And what do these three groups have in common? They tend to be a little bit more conservative in Texas. So if you want to run for governor and you want major funding, you're going to have to be a little bit more conservative compared to other states. They may have to move a little bit more to the right to win the support that they need. And of course, Clayton Williams is not the only political candidate to say things that they shouldn't. There's Todd Akin in Missouri who said that women can't get pregnant through rape because their bodies have ways of shutting it down. Obviously, these are not things candidates should be saying if they're running for higher office. Okay, so in terms of the more informal qualifications, we have not had a non-white governor since independence. We've had a couple of Hispanic nominees, but no Hispanic Latino candidate has been governor. They've all been white. And given the state's shifting demographics, that may change with the next election or within the next 10 years. There have been three Roman Catholic candidates, two of whom were Democrats, one in 1972 and one in 2002. But the only Roman Catholic governor we've actually had is Greg Abbott, which is a little bit surprising given how Catholic Texas is in some ways, but more often than not, candidates do tend to be Protestant. We've had two female governors only, Miriam Ferguson and Ann Richards. We have seen more women running for office, and in 2018, the governor candidate for the Democrats was a woman named Lupe Valdez, who was the first openly gay candidate for governor in Texas. And even though she lost pretty badly, it was still a very important step forward for Texas that we actually had an openly gay candidate for state office. So there is some progress being made in terms of who's running. Not necessarily who's winning, but at least in people who are running. Most governors tend to be lawyers or business people. You got to have money to fund your election at the start. So it makes sense that most of them are going to be in high-income jobs like CEOs, lawyers, business owners, and so on. They're also going to be involved in civic, social, and business organizations. They're probably going to belong to their local country club, the Elks, the Freemasons, and things like that. Probably heavily involved in their local church as well. And their image usually is to promote families and stability. The governor with his kids and grandkids and dog, white picket fence, the whole 9 yards. And Ann Richards, even though she was divorced, she used her family. She would be photographed with her kids and her grandkids to promote the image of family. So they like to promote their image as good, solid leaders. My wife, my kids, my pets, etc. Present a very wholesome image to the voters. So again, no minority governors yet. Only one Catholic governor, only two women so far. And again, they do tend to be very, very wealthy. Also, Governor Abbott is the only governor we've had so far to be in a wheelchair because of the accident he had when he was out running. So he is an exception to the rule in some ways. All right, so there's 5 formal roles that the governor has and 2 informal. We'll break down these roles on Wednesday, but basically the formal roles are the chief executive, chief legislator, commander-in-chief, chief of the state, and chief diplomat. The 2 informal are chief of party and leader of the people. So again, the 5 formal roles are chief executive, chief legislator, commander-in-chief, chief of state, and chief diplomat. And the 2 informal roles are chief of party and leader of the people. And again, we'll break these down on Wednesday. The reality is that the governors need a good leadership style to keep control of the state. They need to be able to work with the legislature. They need to be able to work with the members of the state bureaucracy. They need to be able to compromise, to horse trade, to put forward their agenda in a way that gets the legislature on board rather than against them. Governor White was able to work with the state legislature to reform the schools and deal with regulations of public utilities. Governor Richards, though, she was a bit more heavy-handed and partisan, so she had trouble getting her agenda through. She did make some changes to state agencies. She signed the charter for our school to create South Texas College. She had a lot of difficulty getting the state legislature to do what she wanted. Governor Bush came in, was more bipartisan, campaigning on things like reforming the juvenile justice system, court reform, education, and welfare. Because the state legislature was still divided Democrat-Republican, he was willing to work with the Democrats to get his legislation through. So he was better at working with the state legislature compared to Governor Richards. Governor Perry, on the other hand, was very, very, very heavy-handed. He vetoed 82 bills in the 2001 legislative session alone, and allowed redistricting to dominate his thinking rather than things like school finance. So he had a lot of trouble getting the state legislature on board. He wasn't as bipartisan, as cooperative, had the attitude of my way or the highway, so he wasn't very well liked by the members of the state legislature. Governor Abbott is a bit better about that. He is more cooperative, more empathetic, more willing to work with the members of the state legislature. It's one thing to have the power, it's another thing to be able to use it. If you cannot negotiate, if you cannot compromise, if you try to push your agenda without discussion, you're not going to get anywhere. So the governor has to be good at negotiating, has to be good at talking, at compromise. Otherwise, they'll never get anything done. Now, the governor here is weaker compared to other states. Because there was such abuse of power in the post-Civil War government, in 1876, the governor was limited in his or her constitutional authority. So this is deliberate. This is an attempt to keep the governor from abusing his or her powers. And it is a plural executive. Our state executive branch includes 5 other elected officials, 2 elected boards, a couple of boards and commissions. So it does fracture the executive branch. The policy making becomes difficult when you have a whole bunch of people fighting over who gets what part of this. So he or she's not as able to push their agenda compared to other states. They're not as powerful constitutionally. They have gotten some control over health and human services and economic development, bringing in new businesses. Governor Abbott negotiating with Tesla to bring in a new plant. But the reality is the voters like the governor being a bit weak. They're reluctant to give the governor more power out of fear of abuse of power. They like that the governor is limited in what he or she can do. So our governor is important, in a lot of ways, but he or she just isn't as strong compared to other states. And for now, the voters prefer it that way. It would probably take quite a bit for the voters to be willing to give the governor more power. So for now, Governor Abbott's part of a thorough, complex executive branch that doesn't give him as much authority as he might like. Okay, so that's all of the lecture for today. Wednesday, we will finish up the governor. Make sure you submit your midterm exam by 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday. And if you have any questions about today's lecture or the midterm, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. Again, I'm sorry the technology wasn't cooperating this morning so we could have more of an interactive discussion here. But those of you who will be in class on Wednesday and online, you can ask questions about the lecture then. So that's all for today. If you have any questions, no. Otherwise, I will see you all on Wednesday.